The old man who refused to adopt any cat, except this one-eyed Tabby. Saturday morning in Millbrook was as predictable as the chiming of St. Bristan's bells. The small American town awakened to the scent of freshly fried donuts wafting from the corner bakery, while colorful banners for the community fair fluttered in the gentle breeze. Like clockwork, Mrs. Pruitt watered her marigolds at 7, and Mr. Landon collected his newspaper at 7:15, tipping his hat to anyone who passed by. Before we continue with the story, I want to ask you for something very special. Please subscribe to the channel. Every subscription helps our videos reach more people, and with that we can feed even more stray cats in need. Click subscribe now and be part of this chain of love for cats. At precisely 9 o'clock, Alder Shaw pushed open the heavy glass door of the Millbrook Animal Shelter. The bell above the entrance announced his arrival with a cheerful jingle that contrasted sharply with his solemn demeanor. At 72, Alder carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who had weathered life's storms without much complaint. His weathered hands, marked by decades of manual labor, held a simple cardboard box for transporting whatever cat he might choose today. "Good morning, Mr. Shaw," chirped Tessa, the young weekend volunteer. "We've been expecting you. Ms. Kearney mentioned you called about adopting a cat." Alder nodded once, his expression unchanged. "Just looking for some company around the house," he said, the gravel in his voice suggesting these were more words than he typically strung together at once. "Well, you're in luck. We have so many wonderful cats needing homes right now." Tessa's enthusiasm bubbled over as she led him toward the main cat room. "We just got the sweetest little orange tabby kittens yesterday. They're absolutely adorable. Or if you'd prefer an adult cat, we have several who are already litter trained, and I'd like to see them all, if that's all right," Alder interrupted quietly. Tessa nodded, pushing open the door to reveal a long corridor lined with cages. The symphony of meows grew louder, plaintive cries, chirpy greetings, and the occasional demanding yowl. Paws reached through bars, bright eyes followed their movement, and fuzzy faces pressed hopefully against the metal mesh. Ms. Kearney, the shelter manager, emerged from her office when she heard them enter. A woman in her 50s, with practical shoes and a no-nonsense bun, she'd dedicated 20 years to finding homes for Millbrook's abandoned animals. "Mr. Shaw, good to see you in person," she said, extending her hand. "I have some suggestions based on what you mentioned on the phone. Older cats who'd appreciate a quiet home." Alder shook her hand but said nothing. His eyes were already scanning the room, methodically moving from cage to cage. Ms. Kearney began pointing out various candidates: a plump calico lounging on a cushion, a dignified Siamese with striking blue eyes, a fluffy Persian grooming herself fastidiously. Alder acknowledged each with a slight nod, but continued walking. "This is Mittens. She's very affectionate," Tessa offered, opening a cage where a black and white cat purred loudly. "Would you like to hold her?" Alder shook his head and kept walking. With each passing cage, the shelter staff exchanged increasingly puzzled glances. Alder barely paused, showing no interest in the cats that typically captured visitors' hearts. Not the playful ones batting toys, not the vocal ones meowing for attention, not even the elegant ones posing regally on perches. He moved with steady determination toward the end of the corridor. In the very last cage, partially obscured by shadow, sat a cat unlike the others. The tabby's coat was mottled with uneven patches of brown, black and white, as if assembled from spare parts. Where most cats watched visitors with two attentive eyes, this one observed the world through a single green orb. The other socket was sealed shut, surrounded by subtle scarring that continued across his face like the ghosts of old battles. His remaining ear was notched and his tail bent slightly at the tip. According to the worn card on his cage, his name was Quill, and he'd been at the shelter for 14 months, longer than any other cat. When Alder reached this final cage, his pace slowed. For the first time since entering, he stopped completely. He lowered himself to one knee, wincing slightly at the protest of aging joints, and brought his face level with the cage. The tabby didn't approach the bars or make a sound. He simply stared back at Alder with his single, unblinking eye. The silence between them stretched for nearly a minute. Then, so quietly that Tessa and Ms. Kearney had to strain to hear, Alder whispered, "It's him." Ms. Kearney stepped forward, concerned. "Mr. Shaw, I should mention that Quill has been here quite a while. He's had a difficult past and can be challenging. Perhaps you'd like to see some of our other cats who might be more—" "No." Alder's response was gentle but firm. "This is the one I want." "Are you sure?" Tessa asked, Her brow furrowed. "We have many more sociable cats who—" "I'm sure." Alder rose slowly to his feet, his decision apparently final. Ms. Kearney tried once more. "Maybe you'd like to at least interact with him before deciding, or see some better options." "This is not a better or worse situation, Ms. Kearney," Alder replied, his voice steady. "This is the cat I'm taking home today." Bewildered but unable to find a reason to refuse him, Alder's home visit had checked out perfectly, and his references spoke highly of his responsible nature. Ms. Kearney reluctantly began the adoption paperwork. As Tessa carefully transferred the indifferent Tabby to a carrier, the entire shelter staff watched, with the same unspoken question hanging in the air. Why would anyone choose that particular cat when surrounded by so many friendlier, prettier, more perfect options? Alder completed the forms without comment, paid the adoption fee, and lifted the carrier with the same careful precision he applied to everything. Without elaboration or explanation, he walked out the door with Millbrook's least wanted cat, leaving behind a chorus of confusion and a single empty cage that had been occupied for far too long. As the door closed behind him, Tessa turned to Ms. Kearney with wide eyes. "What just happened?" Ms. Kearney shook her head slowly, watching through the window as Alder placed the carrier carefully in his truck. "I have absolutely no idea." Inside the carrier, Quill remained motionless, his single eye fixed on nothing in particular, perhaps wondering what strange twist of fate had suddenly changed the trajectory of his solitary existence. Aldershaw's house on Elm Street stood like a quiet testament to a bygone era. The two-story wooden structure with its wraparound porch had weathered nearly 8 decades of Millbrook seasons, surviving blizzards, withstanding summer storms, and witnessing countless dawns break over the eastern hills. Much like its owner, the house maintained a dignified presence despite its age, with every loose board promptly fixed, every gutter reliably cleared. Alder parked his truck in the gravel driveway and carried the cat carrier up the porch steps with deliberate care. The boards creaked beneath his boots, a familiar sound that had become as much a part of home as the ticking of the grandfather clock in the living room. He paused at the door, keys in hand, suddenly aware that he was about to disrupt a solitude he'd cultivated for years. "Well," he murmured to the carrier, "this is it." Inside, the house smelled of wood polish, coffee, and the lingering scent of yesterday's pot roast. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains, creating dappled patterns on the hardwood floor. Everything had its place: books arranged by height on the shelves, cushions positioned at precise angles on the sofa, a single coffee mug resting on a coaster beside his reading chair. The silence was profound, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the clock and the occasional creak of settling wood. Alder placed the carrier on the floor in the living room and opened its door. Then he straightened up, walked to his favorite armchair and sat down with his newspaper, deliberately not watching the carrier. This was not indifference, it was respect for boundaries, something Alder understood intimately. "Come out when you're ready," he said to the air as if talking to himself. No rush. The carrier remained still, no sound emerging from its shadowy interior. Alder glanced at his watch, a practical timepiece with a worn leather strap that had been with him for decades. It was past lunchtime. With the same methodical movement that characterized all his actions, he rose and walked to the kitchen, leaving plenty of space between himself and the carrier. At the kitchen counter, Alder prepared a simple meal, a ham sandwich, a pickle spear, and a glass of iced tea. His movements were precise, the result of years of solitary routine. As he assembled his lunch, he glanced at the set of wrenches and plumbing tape he'd left on the counter that morning. He'd been planning to fix the leaky faucet in the downstairs bathroom, a task that would now wait until tomorrow. He filled a shallow bowl with water and placed it on the floor near the refrigerator, then opened a can of the cat food the shelter had recommended and scooped it into another bowl. Both dishes were old, practical stoneware, nothing special but sturdy and reliable. After arranging a litter box in the corner of the laundry room, Alder returned to his chair with his lunch. "Food and water in the kitchen," he announced to the room. "Litter box by the washing machine. Help yourself whenever you're ready." The carrier remained silent and still. Throughout the afternoon, Alder went about his usual Saturday routine, reading the newspaper from cover to cover, listening to a baseball game on the radio, and dusting the bookshelves with careful attention to each volume. Occasionally, he would glance toward the carrier, but he made no move to interfere with whatever process was unfolding within it. As evening approached, he prepared a simple dinner, ate at the kitchen table with his crossword puzzle propped against the salt shaker, and washed his dishes immediately afterward. The food and water bowls in the corner remained untouched. When night fell, Alder turned on a single lamp in the living room and lit the fireplace. Though spring was approaching, the evening still carried a chill that seeped through the old windows. The flames cast dancing shadows across the walls, and the scent of burning applewood filled the room. Alder settled into his armchair with a dog-eared copy of a Louis L'Amour western he'd read at least a dozen times before. The cat carrier hadn't moved, and no sound had emerged from it all day. A less patient man might have worried or intervened, but Alder simply turned a page and continued reading. "I'm turning in soon," he announced to the empty room. "You're welcome to come out and explore or stay put if that feels safer. This house has stood for 80 years. It'll still be here in the morning." After finishing his chapter, Alder marked his place with a faded receipt, set the book on the side table, and prepared for bed. He checked the locks, turned off the lights except for a small one in the hallway, and banked the fire. Before heading upstairs, he paused beside the carrier. "Oh, you're safe here," he said softly, speaking the first words directed specifically at the cat. Then he climbed the stairs to his bedroom, his footsteps fading into the quiet house. The grandfather clock in the corner struck 11 times, its chimes reverberating through the empty rooms. Outside, an owl hooted from the old oak tree in the backyard. Inside the carrier, a single green eye remained open, watchful and wary in the dim light. It wasn't until nearly midnight that the silence was broken by the faint sound of movement. The tip of a nose appeared at the carrier opening, twitching slightly as it tested the air. Then, cautiously, Quill emerged. His movements were fluid but alert, each step calculated as he ventured into unknown territory. The tabby paused at the edge of the carpet, his single eye scanning the room with military precision. Every shadow was assessed, every corner evaluated. When nothing moved or threatened, he took another step forward, then another. The house was foreign terrain, filled with unfamiliar scents and sounds, but somewhere beneath the wariness was a faint curiosity. Quill made his way along the perimeter of the room, staying close to the walls. He sniffed the legs of the coffee table, investigated the base of the bookshelf, and paused beneath the ticking grandfather clock, his head tilted as if trying to understand this strange, rhythmic creature. The exploration took him to the kitchen, where he discovered the untouched food and water. He sniffed both, but consumed neither, still too unsettled for appetite. The litter box was given similar inspection before he retreated to the living room. As the night deepened, Quill completed his reconnaissance of the ground floor. He found hiding places beneath the sofa, behind the curtains, under the sideboard in the dining room, and mentally mapped escape routes. The stairs leading to the upper floor remained unexplored territory, a boundary he wasn't yet ready to cross. In the small hours of the morning, when the house was at its quietest, Quill finally returned to the carrier. It was the only familiar thing in this strange new world, a small space where he could feel secure, protected on all sides. He curled up inside it, his single eye still open, watching and waiting as the night ticked away toward dawn. Upstairs, Alder lay awake longer than usual, listening for sounds from below. He knew better than to expect instant trust or affection. Some wounds, both visible and invisible, took time to heal. As he drifted toward sleep, he thought about the scars on the cat's face and the stories they might tell, stories perhaps not so different from the ones Alder himself carried, though his own scars lay deeper than skin. The first night passed in silent agreement. No demands, no expectations, just two solitary beings sharing space and respecting boundaries. It was, Alder thought as sleep finally claimed him, a reasonable start. 3 days passed in a careful dance of distance and observation. Alder maintained his routines with clockwork precision. Coffee at 6, breakfast at 7, lunch at noon, dinner at 6 in the evening. Quill remained largely invisible during daylight hours, though the gradually diminishing level of food in the bowl and the occasional evidence in the litter box confirmed his nighttime activities. On the 4th morning, Alder discovered the first sign of change. The cat food bowl had been moved 6 inches from its original position. The floor around it was spotlessly clean, suggesting Quill had dragged it rather than spilled from it. Alder returned the bowl to its designated spot without comment. That evening, when he set out fresh food, Alder noticed something unusual about Quill's eating habits. The cat had emerged from whatever hiding place he'd claimed during the day and was watching from the shadow of the dining room doorway. When Alder stepped away, Quill approached the bowl cautiously, sniffed it, then walked away without eating. 10 minutes later he returned, only to repeat the same behavior. After the 3rd retreat, Alder frowned thoughtfully. He walked to the kitchen drawer where he kept odds and ends and pulled out a notebook he used for household inventory. Flipping to a blank page, he jotted down, "Won't eat from shallow bowl?" The next morning, Alder drove to Millbrook's only pet store, a small establishment wedged between the pharmacy and the hardware store. The bell above the door announced his arrival, drawing the attention of the teenage clerk who was arranging chew toys on a display rack. "Morning, Mr. Shaw," the boy greeted him. Most of Millbrook's residents recognized Alder, even if they didn't know him well. "Can I help you find something?" "Cat bowls," Alder replied succinctly. "Deep ones." The clerk led him to an aisle lined with pet dishes in various shapes, sizes, and colors. Alder studied them carefully, his weathered fingers testing the depth of each one. Finally, he selected a simple ceramic bowl with high sides, similar to what might be used for soup. "Anything else today?" the clerk asked as he rang up the purchase. Alder hesitated, then added, "What's good for a cat that doesn't seem to have much appetite?" The question launched a 20-minute conversation about cat food varieties, feeding schedules, and palatability enhancers that left Alder's head spinning. He departed with the deep bowl, 6 different types of cat food, and a pamphlet on welcoming your new cat home that the clerk had thrown in for free. Back at the house, Alder emptied the old food and washed the shallow bowl thoroughly. He placed the new deeper bowl in exactly the same spot and filled it with one of the premium foods the clerk had recommended, something with gravy and tender morsels that cost 3 times what Alder typically spent on his own meals. That evening, as Alder read in his armchair, he heard the faint sound of crunching from the kitchen. He didn't look up, but a slight softening around his eyes betrayed his satisfaction. In his notebook he wrote, "Prefers deep bowl. Likes chicken flavor." The small victory encouraged Alder to observe more closely. Over the next few days he began to notice patterns in Quill's behavior. The cat was more active at dawn and dusk, preferred pathways along walls rather than crossing open spaces, and startled at certain sounds. The garbage truck on Wednesday morning, the neighbor's lawnmower on Thursday afternoon, the mail carrier's footsteps on the porch each day at 11. On Friday morning, exactly 1 week after the adoption, Alder came downstairs to find Quill sitting in the center of the kitchen floor. It was the first time the cat had positioned himself so openly, so vulnerably. Both man and cat froze, caught in a moment neither had anticipated. "Morning," Alder said softly, careful not to move suddenly. Quill's single eye studied him intently. Then, with deliberate slowness, the cat blinked once, a long, slow closing and opening of his eye. Alder, who had researched cat behavior extensively over the past week, recognized the gesture for what it was, a sign of trust, perhaps the highest compliment a cat could offer. He returned the slow blink, then continued to the coffee pot, as if nothing extraordinary had happened, though his heart beat a little faster than usual. As Alder prepared his morning coffee, Quill remained in the kitchen, watchful but no longer hiding. It was a small shift, but significant, the first crack in a wall of wariness that had been built over years of hard experience. Later that day, Alder discovered another of Quill's preferences, quite by accident, while retrieving a box of Christmas decorations from the basement for his neighbor Mrs. Vale, who insisted on starting her holiday crafts in spring. Alder noticed Quill watching him from the top of the stairs. When he emerged with the dusty cardboard box, the cat's attention seemed unusually focused. Alder set the box down in the living room and opened it to check the contents before delivering it next door. Inside were tangled strings of lights, faded tinsel, and an assortment of homemade ornaments. At the bottom was a smaller wooden box that contained Mrs. Vale's collection of delicate glass angels. As Alder lifted this wooden box, he noticed Quill had moved closer, his single eye fixed on the container. Curious, Alder set the box on the floor. Quill approached cautiously, sniffed the corners, then promptly sat beside it with what appeared to be contentment. "You like the box?" Alder asked, bemused. That evening, after delivering the Christmas decorations, minus one wooden box that Mrs. Vale said he was welcome to keep, Alder cleaned the small container thoroughly. He sanded rough edges, lined it with an old flannel shirt he no longer wore, and placed it near the warmth of the fireplace. When he returned from brushing his teeth before bed, Quill was curled inside the box, his eye closed in what appeared to be peaceful sleep. It was the first time Alder had seen the cat truly relaxed, truly at rest. In his notebook, Alder wrote, "Prefers wooden box to cat bed. Security, smell, size." The days began to develop a new rhythm. Alder still maintained his routines, but they expanded to include observations and adjustments for his feline housemate. He discovered that Quill preferred running water from the tap to still water in a bowl, enjoyed watching birds through the east-facing windows in the morning, and had an unexplained aversion to the color red. Each discovery felt like deciphering a new word in a foreign language, the language of a creature who had learned to be cautious, whose experiences had taught him that the world was unpredictable and often unkind. Alder approached this translation work with the same careful attention he gave to fixing loose floorboards or calibrating the grandfather clock, with patience, precision, and respect for the integrity of what he was working with. 2 weeks after Quill's arrival, the cat began to venture upstairs during daylight hours. Alder would find him on the landing, in the hallway, or sometimes perched on the windowsill in the spare bedroom, tracking the movement of leaves or squirrels in the yard below. The territory they shared expanded gradually, negotiated through silent agreements and respectful distances. On a rainy Tuesday, as Alder sat at his desk paying bills, he felt a presence beside his chair. Looking down, he saw Quill sitting just within arm's reach, watching the movement of the pen across paper with apparent interest. Alder continued writing, pretending not to notice, but internally he recognized another milestone in their developing relationship. That evening, as Alder read by the fire, Quill emerged from his box and crossed the room with purposeful steps. He stopped 3 feet from Alder's chair, sat down, and simply observed. The single green eye reflected the dancing flames, while the firelight cast soft shadows across the scars on his face, making them seem less harsh, more like the natural variations in a piece of weathered wood. "You're safe," Alder said quietly, not looking directly at the cat. It was the same phrase he'd spoken on their first night, but now it carried the weight of demonstrated truth rather than mere intention. Quill's ear twitched at the sound of Alder's voice, but he didn't retreat. Instead, he settled more comfortably on the carpet, his paws tucked beneath him, his gaze still fixed on the man in the chair. The clock ticked, the fire crackled, and the space between them felt less like a barrier and more like a bridge, not yet crossed but solidly built. In the quiet of that evening, something shifted in the atmosphere of the old house on Elm Street. The silence, which had once felt empty, now seemed full of unspoken understanding. Patience, Alder was discovering, had its own language, and in that language, he and Quill were beginning to converse fluently. The third Sunday after Quill's arrival dawned bright and clear, with the kind of crisp spring air that seemed to polish every surface to a shine. Alder woke at his usual time, dressed in the neat but unremarkable clothes he wore for his weekly visit to St. Briston Church, and descended the stairs to find Quill already awake and watching from his box by the fireplace. "Morning," Alder greeted him, a habit he'd developed despite the cat's silent responses. "I'll be out for a few hours." "Church service." He prepared a light breakfast, filled Quill's food and water bowls, and checked his appearance in the small mirror by the front door, a ritual unchanged for decades. His reflection showed a man with silver hair neatly combed, a clean-shaven face lined by years and weather, and eyes the color of faded denim. Nothing remarkable, nothing that would draw attention in a crowd, just the way he preferred it. At 8:45, Alder put on his jacket and headed for the door. "Back before noon," he told Quill, who had moved to the windowsill to observe the morning birds. The walk to St. Briston took exactly 12 minutes at Alder's measured pace. The church stood at the center of Millbrook, its white steeple visible from almost anywhere in town. Alder had attended services there every Sunday since moving to Millbrook 15 years ago, though he rarely participated in the social gatherings that followed. He preferred the quiet comfort of familiar rituals to the unpredictable demands of conversation. As always, he slipped into his usual pew near the back, just as the organ prelude began, nodded politely to the Harriman family who sat across the aisle, and settled in for Reverend Collins' predictably meandering sermon. The service proceeded exactly as it had for hundreds of Sundays before. Hymns sung with varying degrees of enthusiasm, announcements about the upcoming bake sale and youth group car wash, prayers for community members facing illness or hardship. At precisely 11 o'clock, as Reverend Collins concluded the benediction, the church bell began to toll. The deep, resonant sound rolled across Millbrook, marking the hour as it had for over a century. Back at the house on Elm Street, Quill was dozing in a patch of sunlight on the living room floor when the first toll reached his ears. The effect was immediate and dramatic. His body tensed, fur bristling along his spine. His single eye flew open, pupils contracting to a thin slit against the green. With a fluid movement born of instinct rather than thought, he leaped to his feet and bolted across the room. But instead of seeking shelter under furniture or in his box, Quill raced to the front window. There he stood on his hind legs, front paws pressed against the glass, his entire body rigid with attention. His ear swiveled toward the sound, catching each resonant note as the bell continued its 11-stroke count. When the final toll faded, Quill remained at the window, his eye alert and searching, his body still charged with an energy that seemed disproportionate to the ordinary Sunday sound. Alder returned home 20 minutes later to find Quill still at the window, though now sitting rather than standing, his gaze fixed on the distant church steeple just visible above the rooftops of Elm Street. "What's got you so interested?" Alder asked as he hung up his jacket. Quill turned at the sound of Alder's voice, and for a moment there was something in his single-eyed gaze that seemed almost questioning, as if he were trying to connect the man with the sound that had so captured his attention. Throughout the afternoon, Alder noticed Quill returning to the window repeatedly, especially when the bell rang for the evening service at 6. The cat's reaction was less dramatic than in the morning, but no less attentive, a focused stillness, an alertness that suggested the sound held some significance beyond its mere presence. That night, as Alder prepared for bed, he found himself thinking about Quill's reaction to the church bells. It seemed too specific, too consistent to be random. In his notebook, between entries about food preferences and sleep patterns, he wrote, "Responds strongly to church bells. Previous experience?" The question lingered in Alder's mind as he drifted off to sleep. What memories might those solemn tones trigger in a creature who had known life before the shelter? What associations had been formed in those years, of which Alder knew nothing? The following Sunday brought a repeat performance. This time Alder was prepared. He deliberately stayed home from church, ostensibly to work on a squeaky floorboard in the hallway, but primarily to observe Quill's reaction to the bells. At 11 o'clock precisely, the distant tolling began. Quill, who had been watching Alder's repair work from a safe distance, immediately stiffened. His head turned toward the sound, and within seconds he was at the window again, attentive and alert. "So you know that sound, don't you?" Alder said quietly, setting aside his tools and approaching slowly. "It means something to you." Quill didn't acknowledge Alder's presence, his focus entirely on the distant bells. When the tolling ended, he remained at the window for several minutes before finally turning away, his movements somehow both satisfied and disappointed. That afternoon, Alder sat at his desk with a fresh cup of coffee and his notebook. He flipped through the pages of observations he'd collected over the past 3 weeks: food preferences, sleep patterns, responses to various stimuli. A picture was emerging, not just of a cat with particular tastes, but of a creature whose behaviors had been shaped by specific experiences. The bell reaction particularly intrigued him. It wasn't fear. Quill didn't hide or show signs of distress. It was more like recognition, perhaps even anticipation. But of what? On impulse, Alder reached for the phone and dialed the number for the Millbrook Animal Shelter. After a brief wait, Ms. Kearney came on the line. "Mr. Shaw," she said, surprise evident in her voice. "How is everything going with Quill?" "Fine," Alder replied. "I was wondering if you might have any information about where he was found before the shelter." There was a pause on the line. "Let me check his intake records," Ms. Kearney said. The sound of shuffling papers came through the receiver. "Here it is. Quill was brought in by Animal Control. They found him in the alley behind St. Briston Church during that big snowstorm in January, year before last. Poor thing was half frozen, injured and severely malnourished." "The church," Alder repeated, his suspicion confirmed. "Was he wearing a collar? Any identification?" "No collar, no chip. Based on his condition, the vet thought he'd been astray for quite some time. The injuries to his eye and face were old, already healed, though not particularly well." Miss Kearney paused. "Why do you ask? Is there a problem?" "No problem," Alder assured her. "Just trying to understand him better." After hanging up, Alder sat for a long time staring at his notes. The church bells, a sound that marked time in Millbrook with reassuring predictability. For a creature living on the streets, especially during winter, predictability might be more than comfort. It could be survival. The next morning, Alder woke earlier than usual. After his coffee, he put on his jacket and called out to Quill, who was grooming himself on the sofa, another sign of increasing comfort in the house. "I'm going out for a bit back soon." The walk to St. Briston took on a different quality in the early morning light. The streets were quiet, the air still holding the chill of night. When Alder reached the church, he didn't approach the main entrance, but instead walked around to the back, to the alley where Quill had once been found. It was an unremarkable space, a narrow passage between the church and the parish hall, lined with trash bins and the occasional discarded item waiting for the next rummage sale. A metal fire escape descended from the parish hall kitchen, its lowest rung just high enough to be out of reach for most animals. Alder stood quietly, trying to see the space through different eyes, through a single, desperate eye, perhaps. The overhang of the roof would provide some shelter from snow and rain. The kitchen vents would release warm air and cooking smells. And most importantly, the church bell would mark the hours with unwavering consistency, a clock for those who couldn't read time any other way. Had Quill lived here? Had he learned to anticipate the kindness of parishioners leaving scraps after Sunday potlucks? Had the bell become a signal for potential food, safety, or human contact? Alder examined the area more closely. Near the base of the fire escape, partially hidden behind a stack of old hymnals waiting to be recycled, he spotted something that made his heart beat a little faster. A small, sheltered space that might perfectly fit a medium-sized cat. And beside it, barely visible unless one was looking for it, the faded remnant of what might once have been a makeshift feeding station, a chipped saucer pushed against the wall. Someone had cared, even if not enough to take Quill home. Someone had provided food, and perhaps a moment of kindness in this alley, and the bells had marked those moments with their predictable toll. That evening, as Alder and Quill sat in their now customary positions, Alder in his chair with a book, Quill on the carpet near the fire, Alder found himself studying the cat with new understanding. "The bells meant food for you, didn't they?" he said softly, "or at least the possibility of it. Something good in a hard world." Quill blinked slowly at him, neither confirming nor denying, but the connection between them felt somehow stronger, as if Alder had translated another crucial word in their developing language. In the weeks that followed, Alder noticed that Quill began to anticipate the bells, moving to the window just before they would toll, as if he'd internalized their schedule. And Alder, without quite planning it, began to create his own ritual, a small treat offered to Quill after the Sunday morning bells, a tiny celebration of survival and predictability, of patterns that could be trusted. It was a small thing, this shared understanding of what the bells might mean. But in the quiet house on Elm Street, small things were building, one upon another, into something that neither man nor cat had expected to find again, the foundation of connection. May arrived with a burst of color and fragrance, transforming Millbrook's orderly streets into a canvas of blooming dogwoods, bright tulips, and the delicate white stars of flowering dogwood trees. The change wasn't limited to the landscape. Inside the house on Elm Street, subtle transformations continued to unfold. Quill had claimed territories throughout the house: the sunny spot on the living room floor in the morning, the window seat in the spare bedroom during afternoons, and most significantly, the foot of Alder's bed at night. This last development had occurred so gradually that Alder couldn't pinpoint exactly when it had begun. One evening, Quill had simply followed him upstairs and settled at the far corner of the bed. By morning, the cat had migrated to a spot just beside Alder's feet, where he now slept every night, a warm, steady presence in what had long been a solitary space. The house itself was changing too. A scratching post appeared beside the sofa after Alder noticed Quill's interest in the texture of the upholstery. A collection of cat toys gradually accumulated in a basket by the fireplace, some store-bought, others improvised from household items that had captured Quill's attention. The formal precision of Alder's living space now incorporated small allowances for feline companionship: a blanket draped over the arm of the sofa, a shelf cleared near the window to facilitate bird-watching, water bowls in strategic locations throughout the house. These physical changes reflected a deeper shift in Alder's daily existence. His routines, once rigid and solitary, now accommodated another being's needs and preferences. Morning coffee included a moment to refresh Quill's water. Evening reading was punctuated by occasional breaks to dangle a feather toy when Quill seemed restless. The steady rhythm of Alder's life continued, but with new notes and variations that made the familiar melody somehow richer. On a warm Tuesday in mid-May, Alder was weeding his modest vegetable garden when he noticed something unusual. Quill, who had taken to following him outdoors during yard work, wasn't patrolling the perimeter of the property as he typically did. Instead, the cat was lying beneath the shade of the old maple tree, seemingly uninterested in the birds chattering in its branches, birds that normally commanded his full attention. "Not feeling social today?" Alder asked, straightening from his garden bed and removing his work gloves. Quill blinked slowly, but didn't rise. When Alder approached, the cat's single eye seemed less bright than usual, and his typically immaculate coat looked slightly disheveled, as if he hadn't been grooming with his customary care. Concern bloomed in Alder's chest. He knelt beside Quill and cautiously extended a hand, something he rarely did, respecting the cat's general preference for initiating contact. Quill allowed the touch, another departure from normal behavior. His fur felt warm, too warm, beneath Alder's weathered fingers. "Something's not right with you," Alder murmured, frowning. That evening, Quill refused his dinner, an unprecedented event since they'd resolved the bowl depth issue. He drank water but immediately retreated to his wooden box, curling into a tight ball with his face partially hidden. When the church bells tolled at 6, he didn't move to the window. Alder sat in his chair, pretending to read but actually watching Quill over the top of his book. The cat's breathing seemed slightly labored, and occasional tremors ran through his compact body. Worry, an emotion Alder had managed to largely avoid for years, settled in his stomach like a cold stone. By morning, Quill's condition had worsened. He hadn't touched his water overnight, and when Alder gently stroked his head, the cat barely responded. The single green eye was half closed and dull, lacking its usual alert intelligence. Alder didn't hesitate. He found the carrier in the hall closet, lined it with Quill's favorite blanket, and carefully placed the unresisting cat inside. 10 minutes later, he was driving toward the Millbrook Veterinary Clinic, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his face set in lines of concern that would have surprised anyone who knew him only as the reserved man who sat alone at church. The waiting room was busy with morning appointments. A woman holding a carrier containing a vocal Siamese, a teenager with a leashed beagle who couldn't stop sniffing everything, an elderly couple with a portly Persian in a stroller. Alder approached the reception desk, carrier in hand. "My cat is sick," he said without preamble. "He needs to be seen right away." The receptionist, a young woman with brightly colored hair and multiple earrings, looked up from her computer. "Do you have an appointment, sir?" "No," Alder replied, his voice tightening. "This is urgent. He stopped eating yesterday and barely responds this morning." "I understand your concern," she said, glancing at her screen. "But Dr. Haddad is fully booked today. The earliest we could—" "Please," Alder interrupted, the word strange and rusty in his mouth. He couldn't remember the last time he'd asked for special consideration, the last time he'd allowed urgency to override his habitual respect for systems and schedules. He's never been sick before. Something's very wrong. Perhaps it was the unusual pleading in his voice, or the genuine worry etched on his face, but the receptionist's expression softened. "Let me speak with the doctor," she said, rising from her chair. "In the meantime, could you fill out these forms? If this is your first visit, we'll need to establish a record." Alder nodded gratefully and took the clipboard she offered. As he sat down to complete the paperwork, he was acutely aware of Quill's stillness in the carrier beside him. The forms asked for basic information: owner's name and address, pet's name and age, vaccination history. Alder paused at age, realizing he didn't know exactly how old Quill was. The shelter had estimated between 4 and 6 years, but that was just a guess. In the space for "How long have you owned this animal?" Alder wrote 7 weeks, the brevity of the number striking him as strange, given how completely Quill had integrated into his life. After what felt like an eternity, but was actually less than 15 minutes, a technician in blue scrubs appeared at the door to the examination rooms. "Mr. Shaw, doctor. Haddad can see Quill now." Alder followed her through the door, carrier held carefully level to avoid jostling its occupant. The examination room smelled of antiseptic and had that clinical brightness that made everything look slightly harsher than in natural light. Dr. Haddad, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and efficient movements, greeted him with a brief handshake. "I understand your cat isn't feeling well today," she said, gesturing for Alder to place the carrier on the stainless steel examination table. "When did you first notice symptoms?" As Alder described Quill's recent behavior, Dr. Haddad gently removed the cat from his carrier. Quill offered no resistance, another worrying sign. The veterinarian's hands moved methodically over him, checking temperature, feeling lymph nodes, palpating his abdomen, listening to his heart and lungs. "Has he had access to any plants, chemicals, or unusual foods recently?" she asked, examining Quill's gums. "No," Alder replied. "He doesn't leave the yard, and I don't use chemicals in my garden." Dr. Haddad nodded, continuing her examination. When she carefully lifted Quill's lip to check his teeth, The cat finally showed a flicker of his usual spirit, pulling away with a weak hiss. "Aha," she said, reaching for a penlight. "I think I've found our culprit." With gentle persistence, she managed to examine Quill's mouth more thoroughly. "Mr. Shaw, your cat has a significant dental infection. See this redness and swelling along the gum line? And this tooth here is loose. It's causing him considerable pain, which explains the loss of appetite and lethargy. Left untreated, the infection could spread and become quite serious." Relief and concern mingled in Alder's chest. "Can you fix it?" "Yes, but he'll need dental surgery, extraction of at least one tooth, possibly more, and a thorough cleaning under anesthesia. We'll also start him on antibiotics immediately to address the infection." She straightened and met Alder's eyes directly. "I should warn you that dental procedures for pets can be expensive, especially when extractions are involved. Would you like me to prepare an estimate for you?" Alder nodded, his mind already calculating available funds in his modest checking account. He lived comfortably on his pension, but comfortably meant careful budgeting and few unexpected expenses. While Dr. Haddad stepped out to prepare the estimate, Alder sat beside the examination table, one hand resting lightly on the carrier where Quill had been returned to rest. "We'll get you fixed up," he murmured to the cat. "Don't worry." When the veterinarian returned, she handed Alder a printed form with an itemized list of charges. The total at the bottom caused a momentary tightening in his chest. It was more than he'd spent on his own healthcare in the past year. Dr. Haddad must have seen something in his expression. "We can discuss payment plans if that would be helpful," she offered. "Or if you need time to consider—" "No," Alder interrupted firmly. "Do whatever he needs. Today, if possible. We can perform the procedure this afternoon," she confirmed. "He'll need to stay overnight for observation, but if all goes well, you can pick him up tomorrow morning." The next few hours were a blur of paperwork, decisions, and the strange emptiness of returning home with an empty carrier. The house felt unusually quiet without Quill's presence. No soft padding of paws across the floor, no quiet thump as he jumped from furniture, no gentle purring in the evening stillness. Alder moved through his usual routines mechanically, his thoughts repeatedly returning to the small creature undergoing surgery across town. He found himself checking the clock frequently, wondering what stage of the procedure they had reached, whether Quill was in recovery yet, whether he was comfortable or afraid in the unfamiliar environment of the clinic. At 8 o'clock, the telephone rang, Dr. Haddad calling with an update. The surgery had gone well, 3 teeth had required extraction, but the infection had been addressed, and Quill was recovering comfortably with pain medication. He was still groggy, but had already taken a small amount of soft food, an encouraging sign. That night, Alder slept poorly. The absence at the foot of his bed felt significant in a way he hadn't anticipated. He'd lived alone for years, without noticing the emptiness of his house, but now, after just 7 weeks of sharing his space, the solitude felt hollow rather than peaceful. Morning couldn't come quickly enough. Alder was at the clinic when it opened, carrier in hand, checkbook in pocket. The bill, when presented, was actually higher than the estimate. An additional extraction had been necessary, but Alder signed the check without comment. Some costs weren't meant to be calculated in dollars and cents. Dr. Haddad brought Quill out herself, reviewing care instructions for the coming days. Soft food only, oral antibiotics twice daily, pain medication as needed, a follow-up appointment in 2 weeks. Quill looked smaller somehow in the carrier, his single eye glazed from medication, a small shaved patch on his foreleg where the IV had been placed. He should start feeling much better in a few days, Dr. Haddad assured him. Dental infections can be incredibly painful for cats. Once he's healed, you'll probably notice a significant improvement in his energy and appetite. The drive home was conducted with exaggerated care, Alder avoiding every pothole and taking turns at a glacial pace to minimize any discomfort to his passenger. At home, he set up a recovery area in the living room, the wooden box lined with extra soft blankets, water and food dishes within easy reach, a hot water bottle wrapped in flannel for additional comfort. The next few days established yet another new routine. Administering medication to a cat, Alder discovered, was an art form requiring patience, strategy, and occasionally a towel. The antibiotics, a pink liquid with an apparently offensive taste, were particularly challenging. After several failed attempts involving dropper syringes and undignified wrestling matches, Alder developed a system, hiding the medication in a small amount of tuna-flavored baby food, served on a special spoon that appeared only at medication time. Quill's recovery was gradual but steady. By the end of the week, his eye had regained its bright alertness, and his appetite had returned with enthusiasm, particularly for the soft foods that were now a necessity. The infection that had caused him such pain was resolving, leaving behind a cat who seemed, surprisingly, more relaxed and affectionate than before. One evening, as Alder sat in his armchair reviewing the month's expenses, budget calculations now adjusted to accommodate premium cat food, medication, and a savings fund for future veterinary needs, he felt a gentle pressure against his leg. Looking down, he found Quill leaning against him, the cat's body forming a warm curve that connected them without demand or expectation. It was the first time Quill had initiated such direct contact. Alder remained perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. After a moment, he cautiously lowered his hand to stroke the soft fur between Quill's ears. The cat leaned into the touch, and a rusty rumble emerged from his throat, a purr, the first Alder had heard from him. The sound filled the quiet room, vibrating with a contentment that seemed to echo in Alder's own chest. In that moment, the adjustment to his budget, the disruption to his carefully ordered routine, the worry and care of the past week, all of it seemed insignificant compared to the simple gift of this connection. Caring, Alder was discovering, came with costs that couldn't be anticipated and benefits that couldn't be measured. It required adjustments, sacrifices, and a willingness to step outside the comfortable boundaries of the familiar. But as Quill's purr deepened and the evening shadows lengthened across the room, Alder found himself thinking that some prices were worth paying, some disruptions worth embracing, if they led to moments like this, moments of quiet communion that transformed solitude into something richer and more complete. June in Millbrook brought longer days, afternoon thunderstorms, and the sweet scent of honeysuckle that climbed along fences and property lines throughout the town. On Elm Street, the maple trees formed a green canopy over the sidewalk, dappling the pavement with shifting patterns of sunlight and shadow. By now, Quill's presence in Alder's life had evolved from novelty to normality. The cat moved through the house with the confident ease of someone who knows exactly where he belongs, while Alder found himself increasingly attuned to the subtle language of feline communication, the particular meow that meant hunger versus the one that requested companionship, the tail position that signaled contentment versus the one that warned of overstimulation. What neither of them had anticipated, however, was how their unlikely partnership would begin to affect Alder's relationship with the wider world. The first hint of change came on a warm Saturday morning as Alder was tending to his tomato plants. Quill supervised from the shade of the porch steps, his single eye tracking the occasional butterfly that ventured into the yard. The peaceful scene was interrupted by the sound of the side gate opening. "Morning, mister." "Sure," called a voice that belonged to Junior Vale, Alder's next-door neighbor. A widow in her 60s with silver-streaked dark hair and a perpetual gardening apron, Junior had lived beside Alder for nearly a decade. Their relationship had always been cordial but distant, limited to occasional borrowed garden tools, brief weather observations, and the exchange of holiday cards that never progressed beyond signed names. "Mrs. Vale," Alder acknowledged with a nod, straightening from his gardening. "Please, I've told you a dozen times to call me Junior," she replied, approaching with a glass pitcher in hand. "I made fresh lemonade and thought you might appreciate some. This heat is something else today." Before Alder could formulate a response, his neighbors rarely dropped by unannounced. Junior spotted Quill on the porch steps. "Oh, I didn't know you had a cat." Her voice lifted with delighted surprise. "Recently acquired," Alder replied, accepting the pitcher with a murmured thanks. Junior moved toward the porch, her attention fully captured by Quill, who was watching her approach with cautious interest. "What a character," she said, noting his single eye and battle-scarred face. "What's his name?" "Quill," Alder answered, following her to the porch. He set the lemonade pitcher on the small table beside his wicker chair, then gestured to the matching seat across from it, an invitation he rarely extended. Junior sat down, her eyes still on the cat. "He's not what I would have pictured for you," she remarked candidly, "if you don't mind my saying so." "How so?" Alder asked, genuinely curious, as he poured lemonade into 2 glasses. "Well, you're so—" She gestured vaguely at his neatly tucked shirt, his precisely trimmed lawn, his carefully arranged garden tools. "Orderly, and he's so disorderly," Alder suggested, a hint of amusement in his voice as he handed her a glass. "Character-filled," Junior corrected diplomatically. "Why choose him of all cats?" "I imagine the shelter had plenty of more conventional options." The question was direct but not unkind. asked with the simple curiosity of someone trying to understand a choice that seemed out of character. Alder considered it as he took a sip of lemonade, surprisingly tart and refreshing. "Because he knows what it's like to be left aside," he finally answered, the words coming more easily than he would have expected. "To be overlooked because you don't fit the standard expectation." Junior's expression softened as she studied both man and cat with new understanding. "I see," she said quietly. During their conversation, Quill had remained on the steps, observing but maintaining his distance. Now, in a move that surprised Alder, the cat rose and approached Junior's chair. He circled it once, sniffing delicately at her gardening shoes, then sat beside her, just close enough that she could reach him if she chose. "May I?" Junior asked, looking to Alder for permission. "It's up to him," Alder replied. "He'll let you know his preferences quite clearly." Cautiously, Junior extended her hand, palm down, allowing Quill to inspect it. After a moment's consideration, the cat leaned forward and briefly touched his chin to her fingers, a small gesture of acceptance that Alder knew represented significant trust. "Well, I'm honored," Junior said softly, correctly reading the importance of the moment. She limited herself to that brief contact, respecting the boundaries Quill had established. The three of them sat in surprisingly comfortable silence for a few minutes, sipping lemonade and enjoying the morning warmth. When Junior finally rose to leave, she hesitated at the top of the porch steps. "I'm hosting a small dinner next Friday," she said, adjusting her gardening apron. "Nothing fancy, just a few neighbors. My daughter sent me a new recipe for peach cobbler that I've been wanting to try. I'd be pleased if you'd join us." Her eyes flickered to Quill. "I've heard some remarkable stories about pets being adopted. I'd love to hear how you two found each other." Alder's instinctive response would normally have been a polite refusal. Social gatherings had never been his forte, and he'd perfected the art of declining invitations without causing offense. But something about the morning's interaction, the unexpected ease of their conversation, the simple pleasure of shared lemonade, the curious bridge that Quill had somehow created between them, gave him pause. "Thank you," he heard himself saying. "What time should I arrive?" After Junior left, Alder remained on the porch, contemplating this unexpected turn of events. Quill jumped onto the arm of his chair and settled there, seemingly pleased with himself. "Making social arrangements for me now?" Alder asked the cat, who simply blinked his single eye with what appeared to be smug satisfaction. The dinner at Junior's proved to be the first of many small changes in Alder's social landscape. The gathering itself was pleasant enough, just Junior, her brother and sister-in-law visiting from Virginia, and the Morrisons from across the street. The conversation was easy, centered around gardens, local news, and inevitably pets. When Junior mentioned that Alder had adopted the most remarkable one-eyed cat from the shelter, everyone wanted to hear the story. Alder found himself sharing more than he'd intended, not just about Quill's arrival and adjustment, but about the dental surgery, the bell recognition, and the gradually developing trust between them. What surprised him most was how engaged his audience seemed, asking questions and relating their own experiences with animal companionship. "You should tell Ms. Kearney at the shelter about Quill's progress," Junior suggested as she served her much-anticipated peach cobbler. "They love hearing success stories, especially for the hard-to-place animals." The suggestion lingered in Alder's mind long after the dinner ended. The following week, after his regular grocery shopping, he found himself driving past the Millbrook Animal Shelter. On impulse, he turned into the parking lot. The bell above the door jingled just as it had on his first visit, but this time Tessa's greeting was warmer, more personal. "Mr. Shaw, what a nice surprise. How's Quill doing?" "Well," Alder replied, surprised by how easily the young volunteer remembered both his and Quill's names. "Very well, in fact. I thought Miss Kearney might like an update." Miss Kearney emerged from her office at the sound of his voice, her practical bun as neat as ever, her expression brightening with recognition. "Mr. Shaw, we were just talking about you and Quill the other day. How is our difficult case doing?" Alder found himself pulled into a conversation that lasted nearly an hour. He shared photos from his phone, pictures he hadn't realized he'd been taking until he scrolled through and found dozens of them capturing Quill in various poses around the house and garden. Miss Kearney called over other volunteers and staff members, each expressing delight at seeing the transformation in a cat many had considered unadoptable. "Would you mind if we shared your story on our social media?" Miss Kearney asked. "It might help encourage others to consider adopting some of our special needs cases." The old Alder would have refused immediately, uncomfortable with any form of public attention. The new Alder, the one who had learned to make space for another being's needs, who had discovered the value of unexpected connections, found himself nodding agreement. "If it helps other cats find homes," he said simply. As he was leaving, a young man stocking shelves in the supply room caught his attention. Paxson Reeve, whom Alder recognized from the Millbrook market where the boy worked part-time, was carefully arranging bags of cat food according to brand and type. "Mr. Shaw," Paxson called, setting down a bag of kibble and approaching with an enthusiastic smile. "Is it true you adopted old One-Eye?" "His name is Quill," Alder corrected gently. "But yes, that's awesome," Paxson said with genuine admiration. "I remember him from when I first started volunteering here last fall. Everyone thought he'd be here forever." The young man's expression turned curious. "How'd you get him to trust you?" "He wouldn't let anyone near him when I tried to socialize him." Something about the earnest interest in Paxson's face prompted Alder to respond more fully than he might have otherwise. "Patience helps. Teaching him routines he can count on. It gives him a way to feel safe when everything else has been unpredictable." Paxson nodded thoughtfully. "That makes sense. I never thought about it that way." He glanced back at the shelter cats, many watching hopefully from their cages. "So you think that would work with some of the others? The scared ones?" "Worth trying," Alder suggested. "Consistency matters. Shows them not everything changes without warning." It was a brief exchange, but its effects rippled outward in ways Alder couldn't have anticipated. 2 weeks later, Paxson approached him in the produce section of the market, eager to report that he'd been spending extra time with a particularly fearful shelter cat, establishing consistent routines just as Alder had suggested. The cat was beginning to respond, even allowing Paxson to stroke her briefly the day before. "I've been thinking," Paxson said, as he helped Alder select the ripest peaches. "Maybe I could foster her when she's ready. My mum said it would be okay as long as I handle all the care myself." Alder found himself offering advice about creating safe spaces, respecting boundaries, and the patience required for earning trust. The conversation continued as Paxson helped carry his groceries to the car, a service Alder would have politely declined in the past, but now accepted with grace, recognizing it as the young man's way of extending their discussion. As summer progressed, Alder's world expanded in small but significant ways. Junior's impromptu visits became regular occurrences, often involving homemade treats or plants she thought might interest him. Paxson stopped by occasionally to report on his shelter volunteering and later on his experiences fostering the fearful cat, now named Penny, and showing remarkable progress. Ms. Kearney called every few weeks with questions about Quill's rehabilitation, seeking insights that might help other difficult cases. Through it all, Quill observed with what seemed like satisfaction, as if he'd orchestrated these social connections himself. He remained selective about whom he approached and how much contact he permitted, but his circle of acceptable humans gradually expanded. Junior earned chin rubs. Paxson was allowed to dangle toy mice, and even Reverend Collins, who dropped by after hearing about Quill's bell recognition, was granted the honor of watching the cat respond to the church bells Alder had recorded on his phone. One evening in late July, as Alder sat on his porch with Quill beside him and Junior in the neighboring chair, she made an observation that caught him by surprise. "You know," she said, sipping the iced tea he'd prepared, a recipe she'd shared the previous week, "I've lived next door to you for 9 years, but I feel like I've only really met you in the past few months." Alder considered this, his eyes on the fireflies beginning to rise from the lawn as dusk deepened. "I suppose that's fair," he acknowledged. "It's not a criticism," Junior clarified, "just an observation. It's as if—" She paused, searching for the right words. "As if Quill built a bridge somehow, between you and the rest of us." Alder glanced down at the cat, who was grooming his paw with precise attention, seemingly oblivious to being the topic of conversation. "Ironic," he said after a moment, considering he wasn't exactly social himself. Junior laughed softly. "Maybe that's why it works. You understand each other's boundaries, and somehow that understanding extends to the rest of us." She set down her glass. "Whatever the reason, I'm glad for it. Millbrook is a small town. It's better when we're connected, even in small ways." Later that night, as Alder prepared for bed with Quill watching from his customary spot on the quilt, he found himself reflecting on Junior's words. The cat had indeed built bridges, not just between Alder and others, but between Alder's carefully constructed solitude and a world of connections he hadn't realized he was missing. Caring for Quill had required Alder to reach out to veterinarians, to shelter staff, to neighbors with pet experience. Each contact had led to others, creating a web of relationships that now enriched his days in unexpected ways. What had begun as a simple decision to provide a home for an overlooked cat had somehow opened doors Alder hadn't even known were closed. As he turned out the light and settled beneath the covers, Quill moved to his usual position near Alder's feet. In the darkness, the cat's soft purr filled the room, a sound that had once been rare but was now a regular part of their evening ritual. "You've changed things," Alder murmured to his companion. "More than I expected." Quill's purr deepened in response, as if to say that change, when it came at the right pace and with proper respect for boundaries, wasn't something to fear, but something to embrace. A lesson both of them were still learning, one careful step at a time. August arrived with a vengeance, bringing a heatwave that settled over Millbrook like a heavy blanket. Lawns turned brittle, flowers drooped in garden beds, and the pavement radiated warmth long after sunset. Inside the house on Elm Street, Alder kept the curtains drawn against the sun and ran fans in strategic locations to circulate the cooler air. Quill had developed his own heat management strategy, spending mornings in the shadowy space beneath the porch and afternoons on the cool tile floor of the bathroom. His appetite diminished slightly in the oppressive weather, but he remained hydrated thanks to Alder's careful placement of water bowls throughout the house. On the third Sunday of the month, Alder woke to the sound of distant thunder. Dark clouds massed on the horizon, promising relief from the heat, but threatening a powerful storm in exchange. He considered skipping church. His knee had been bothering him in the humid weather, and the approaching storm would make the walk both uncomfortable and potentially risky. But habit prevailed, and after breakfast, he put on his lightest summer jacket and headed for the door. "I'll be back before the worst of it hits," he told Quill, who was watching from his perch on the windowsill. "Stay inside where it's safe." Quill blinked his single eye, seemingly unconcerned about either Alder's departure or the impending storm. The church service proceeded as usual, though Reverend Collins abbreviated his sermon when a particularly loud thunderclap punctuated a point about divine patience. As the congregation sang the final hymn, rain began to patter against the stained glass windows, quickly intensifying to a steady downpour. Alder lingered in the vestibule, debating whether to wait out the worst of the storm or make a dash for home. Most parishioners were heading for the parish hall, where coffee and conversation would provide pleasant distraction until the weather improved. Alder was about to join them when he noticed movement outside the church doors. Through the rain-streaked glass, he could make out a familiar shape, a medium-sized cat with distinctive mottled fur, sitting on the church steps despite the downpour, his single eye scanning the area with apparent urgency. "Quill?" Alder whispered, disbelief competing with concern. Without hesitation, he pushed open the heavy door and stepped into the rain. "Quill," he called more loudly. "What are you doing here?" The cat's head snapped toward him, and for a moment they simply stared at each other through the curtain of rain, Alder with bewilderment, Quill with what seemed like desperate intensity. Then, as Alder took a step toward him, Quill darted away, not toward home but around the side of the church, toward the alley where he had once taken shelter. "Quill, stop!" Alder called, but the cat disappeared around the corner. Ignoring the rain soaking through his light jacket, Alder followed, his concern growing with each step. Quill had never left the yard before, let alone traveled the 6 blocks to St. Briston. How had he found his way here? And why now, during a storm? When Alder reached the alley, he found it empty. The rain drummed against trash can lids and gurgled in downspouts, but there was no sign of Quill. Alder moved deeper into the passage, scanning every potential hiding place, growing more worried by the minute. "Quill?" he called, his voice nearly lost in a roll of thunder. "Where are you, boy?" Movement caught his eye, a flash of fur beneath the fire escape. Alder approached slowly, rain streaming down his face and plastering his thin hair to his scalp. There, huddled in the same sheltered space where he'd likely spent many difficult nights before the shelter, was Quill. The cat was soaking wet, his fur darkened by rain, his single eye watching Alder with an unreadable expression. "What are you doing out here?" Alder asked, crouching despite the protest of his knee. "Come on, let's go home." He reached toward Quill, expecting the cat to come to him as he now routinely did at home. Instead, Quill shrank back, pressing himself against the wall. "It's just me," Alder said, confusion mingling with hurt at this unexpected rejection. "Come on now." Quill remained motionless, his gaze fixed on Alder but making no move to approach. At that moment, the church bell began to toll, marking the hour with its deep, resonant sound. Quill's ear twitched at each stroke, his body tense with attention. When the final toll faded, the cat seemed to make a decision. He took one small step toward Alder, then stopped as if waiting. Understanding dawned slowly. Quill wasn't afraid of Alder. He was waiting for something. A response, a gesture, a sign that this familiar human was still trustworthy, even in this place of old memories and difficult associations. Alder knelt fully on the wet pavement, ignoring the discomfort and the water soaking through his good pants. He extended his hand, palm up, and spoke the words he'd first offered in the quiet of their home. "You're safe. You're safe with me." Quill didn't move immediately. Rain continued to fall around them, creating a private world of sound and sensation in the narrow alley. Then, with deliberate slowness, the cat took another step forward and another, until he was close enough for Alder to touch. But Alder didn't reach for him. Instead, he waited, palms still extended, allowing Quill to make the final choice. After what felt like an eternity, Quill pressed his wet head against Alder's hand. The simple contact carried enormous weight, a reaffirmation of trust, a bridge across memory, a choice made freely despite old fears. "Let's go home," Alder said softly, and this time when he gathered Quill into his arms, the cat didn't resist. The walk back to Elm Street was uncomfortable. Both of them were soaked through and Alder's knee throbbed with each step, but there was something almost ceremonial about their shared discomfort, as if they were completing a journey begun months ago in this very place. By the time they reached the house, the rain had lessened to a gentle shower. Inside, Alder wrapped Quill in a soft towel, drying him carefully and checking for any injuries that might explain his unprecedented journey. Finding none, he changed out of his own wet clothes and settled in his armchair with the cat on his lap. Another first in their evolving relationship. "How did you even find your way there?" Alder murmured as he gently worked tangles from Quill's damp fur. "6 blocks through territory you've never explored." Quill had no answer, of course, but his single eye held Alder's gaze with a steadiness that suggested the journey had been neither random nor accidental. Something had drawn him to the church. Perhaps the bells, perhaps memories, perhaps some feline instinct humans couldn't comprehend. The incident left Alder unsettled in ways he couldn't fully articulate. That night, he found himself checking the windows and doors with unusual attention, making sure everything was securely latched. The thought of Quill wandering the streets alone, navigating traffic and potential dangers, created a hollow feeling in Alder's chest that persisted even after the cat had settled safely at the foot of his bed. Morning brought sunshine and normalcy. Quill showed no lingering effects from his adventure, eating breakfast with his usual methodical enjoyment and claiming his favorite sunspot for a leisurely bath. But something had shifted in Alder's perception. The bond between them, which he had assumed was steadily strengthening within the safe confines of home, had been tested in unexpected ways. Quill had sought him out across unfamiliar territory, had recognized him even through the blur of rain and thunder, had chosen to return home when staying in his old shelter might have been easier. That afternoon, when Junior stopped by with a basket of homegrown tomatoes, Alder found himself describing the previous day's events with uncharacteristic animation. "It was as if he knew exactly where to find me," he concluded, still puzzled by the entire experience. Junior, who had been sorting her tomatoes by ripeness on Alder's kitchen counter, turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "Animals sense things we don't," she said. "My late husband's dog knew when he was coming home from his business trips, always waiting by the door 20 minutes before his car pulled up. No matter what time of day, she knew." She handed Alder a perfectly ripe tomato. "Maybe Quill sensed your routine, knew where you'd be. Or maybe he was drawn to a place that had meaning for both of you." "Maybe," Alder agreed, though the explanation felt incomplete. He glanced at Quill, who was watching their interaction from the doorway with his usual inscrutable gaze. "The more interesting question," Junior continued, "is what you're going to do now that you know he can leave if he wants to." The question caught Alder off guard. "Do?" "Yes, do," Junior repeated, her hands busy with the tomatoes. "Most cat owners keep their pets indoors for safety, but now you know Quill can find his way around if he decides to go out. Will you try to prevent that, or will you trust him to come back?" Alder hadn't considered this aspect of the situation. The thought of Quill roaming freely, facing the dangers of traffic, hostile animals, or unkind humans, made his stomach tighten with anxiety. Yet the idea of restricting the cat's movement, of enforcing boundaries that Quill clearly knew how to circumvent if motivated, felt somehow contrary to the relationship they had built, a relationship founded on mutual respect and gradually earned trust. "I don't know," he admitted, the uncertainty uncomfortable for a man accustomed to clear decisions and defined parameters. "Well," Junior said, patting his arm with surprising familiarity, "it's something to think about." Trust is a two-way street after all. The conversation lingered in Alder's mind long after Junior had left, with a promise to return the following day for a game of checkers, another new addition to his expanding social calendar. Trust was indeed a two-way street, and until now, he realized, he had been primarily focused on earning Quill's trust rather than extending his own. That evening, as Alder prepared dinner with Quill supervising from the kitchen counter, a location technically off-limits but increasingly tolerated, he made a decision. Opening the kitchen window that faced the backyard, he removed the screen and stepped aside. "Your choice," he told Quill, who had approached the window with evident curiosity. "In or out? I trust you to come back." Quill studied the opening, his whiskers twitching as he sampled the evening air. After a moment's consideration, he gracefully leaped onto the sill, balanced there briefly, then dropped into the garden below. Alder watched as the cat patrolled the perimeter of the yard, investigated a cluster of marigolds, and finally settled on the porch steps, content to observe the world from this vantage point. When darkness fell, Alder called from the back door, "Dinner when you're ready." Then he returned inside, deliberately leaving the door ajar, an invitation rather than a command. 10 minutes later, as Alder set his own plate on the table, he heard the soft padding of paws. Quill appeared in the doorway, tail high, and proceeded directly to his food bowl, as if nothing unusual had occurred. "Good choice," Alder murmured, more relieved than he cared to admit. Over the following weeks, a new pattern emerged. Quill would occasionally venture beyond the yard, sometimes for an hour, sometimes for an afternoon, but he always returned, usually around mealtimes or as evening approached. Alder found himself adapting to this arrangement with less difficulty than he'd anticipated. The anxiety never completely disappeared, but it was tempered by the satisfaction of seeing Quill exercise his independence and still choose to return home. The true test came on a warm Saturday in late August. Alder was repairing a loose shingle on the garden shed when he heard Paxson's voice calling from the front yard. "Mr. Shaw, are you home?" Alder set down his hammer and walked around the house to find Paxson standing on the sidewalk looking unusually distressed. "What's wrong?" he asked, immediately concerned by the young man's expression. "It's Quill," Paxson said, his words tumbling out in a rush. "I just saw him over by Maple Street near the construction site. There's a big dog running loose there, some kind of retriever mix. It was chasing him, and Quill went up a tree, but the dog was still barking and jumping at him when I tried to get closer." Alarm shot through Alder with electric intensity. Maple Street was 4 blocks away, much farther than Quill typically roamed, and the construction site was known for its incomplete fencing and potential hazards. "Show me," he said, already moving toward the sidewalk, not bothering to put away his tools or change out of his work clothes. Paxson led the way at a pace that challenged Alder's aging knees, describing how he'd been cycling to his Saturday shelter volunteer shift when he spotted the confrontation. The dog seemed more playful than aggressive, but Quill clearly hadn't appreciated the distinction. When they reached Maple Street, the scene was exactly as Paxson had described. A half-built house stood behind temporary fencing, its wooden skeleton stark against the blue sky. In the front yard, a medium-sized golden retriever was circling an oak tree, occasionally rising on its hind legs to bark excitedly at something in the branches above. From Alder's position, he couldn't see Quill, but he had no doubt the cat was there, trapped by an animal 3 times his size and with none of his street-smart caution. "The dog must have gotten out from one of the houses nearby," Paxson said, looking around for any sign of an owner. Alder assessed the situation quickly. The dog didn't appear aggressive, its tail was wagging, and its bark seemed more enthusiastic than threatening, but to Quill those distinctions would mean little, and if the cat tried to escape by running across Maple Street, the relatively heavy traffic could pose an even greater danger. Without hesitation, Alder approached the tree, speaking in a calm, firm voice to the dog. "That's enough now. Leave him be." The retriever turned to Alder with friendly interest, momentarily distracted from its quarry. Taking advantage of the dog's diverted attention, Alder moved closer to the tree and looked up. There, on a branch about 10 feet above the ground, was Quill, fur bristling, body low against the wood, his single eye wide with what could only be described as feline indignation. "It's all right," Alder called up to him. "I'm here now." The dog, apparently deciding Alder might be a new playmate, bounded toward him with enthusiastic energy. Before it could jump up or complicate the situation further, Paxson intervened, grabbing the animal's collar and holding it steady. "I've got him, Mr. Shaw," he called. "There's a tag, says his name is Buddy with a phone number." "Call it," Alder instructed, keeping his eyes on Quill. "Let them know their dog is loose." While Paxson managed the dog and made the call, Alder focused on the more challenging task of coaxing Quill from his perch. The cat showed no inclination to descend, even with the immediate threat contained. His experience with dogs had likely been universally negative, and the trauma of the chase still fresh. "You're safe now," Alder said, using the phrase that had become a cornerstone of their communication. "I'm here to take you home." Quill's ear twitched, but he remained frozen in place. Looking around, Alder spotted a discarded wooden pallet leaning against the construction fence. With some effort, he dragged it to the base of the tree and propped it at an angle, creating a makeshift ramp that reached about halfway to Quill's branch. "Come on down," he encouraged, patting the pallet. "Nice and easy." For several long minutes, nothing happened. The dog whined and pulled against Paxson's grip, eager to resume the game. Traffic continued to flow along Maple Street, each passing car a reminder of the dangers that awaited if Quill chose the wrong escape route. "The owner's on his way," Paxson reported, still maintaining his hold on the retriever. "Should be here in about 10 minutes. Lives on Birch Lane." Alder nodded, his attention still fixed on Quill. "We'll wait as long as necessary," he said, settling onto the grass beside the pallet. "He'll come down when he's ready." The minutes stretched on, marked by the dog's occasional whines and the distant sound of a hammer from the construction site. Alder maintained a steady, quiet monologue, reminiscent of their early days together, telling Quill about the weather forecast, the tomatoes ripening in the garden, the checkers game he'd promised Junior. The content mattered less than the familiar cadence of his voice, a reminder of safety and routine in a chaotic situation. Finally, almost imperceptibly, Quill began to move. First, just a slight shift of weight, then a cautious stretching of limbs. With the deliberate precision that characterized all his movements, he began to descend the tree, choosing a route that avoided the pallet entirely, but brought him to a lower branch directly above Alder. "That's it," Alder encouraged softly. "You've got it." From this lower position, Quill studied the ground, the dog and Alder with calculating intensity. Then, with surprising decisiveness, he leaped, not to the ground, but directly onto Alder's shoulders. The impact nearly knocked Alder backward, but he steadied himself, feeling Quill's claws dig into his shirt as the cat established a secure perch. "Bold move," Alder commented, reaching up to gently support the cat's weight. "Let's get you home." A car pulled up to the curb, and a harried-looking man in his 30s emerged, profuse apologies already spilling from his lips as he approached to reclaim his escaped pet. Paxson handed over the dog, accepted the man's thanks with good grace and rejoined Alder, who was still supporting Quill on his shoulders. "Need any help getting him home?" Paxson asked, eyeing the unusual transportation arrangement with amusement. "I think we've got it covered," Alder replied, feeling Quill's weight shift as the cat adjusted his position. "But thank you for everything." The walk home was slow and carefully balanced, with Quill maintaining his elevated position all the way to Elm Street. Only when they reached the familiar territory of the front porch did the cat finally descend, jumping lightly to the wooden boards and proceeding inside as if nothing unusual had occurred. That evening, as Alder treated the small punctures Quill's claws had left in his shoulders, he reflected on the day's events. The cat's independent excursion had nearly ended in disaster, yet when crisis came, it was Alder he had trusted with his safety, jumping directly to him rather than attempting escape on his own. Trust, Alder was discovering, wasn't a single decision, but a series of choices made again and again in different contexts and circumstances. It wasn't about eliminating all risk or controlling all variables. It was about believing in the foundation they had built together, even when tested by the unexpected. When Quill joined him on the sofa that night, settling against his leg with unusual closeness, Alder understood the gesture for what it was. Not just affection, but acknowledgement. They had passed another test together, navigating danger and finding their way back to safety, to home, to the quiet understanding that had become the center of both their lives. "We're learning," Alder told him, stroking the soft fur between his ears. "Both of us. Every day." Quill's response was a slow blink of his single eye, eloquent in its simplicity, the feline equivalent of "I know." September arrived with cooler temperatures and the subtle shifting of light that signaled summer's end. In Millbrook, this transition was marked by familiar rituals, the reopening of schools, the appearance of harvest decorations in shop windows, and the first meetings to plan the annual fall festival that would take place in early October. For Alder, the changing season brought a surprising invitation. Miss Kearney called one Tuesday morning as he was repairing a loose hinge on the kitchen cabinet. "Mr. Shaw," she began after exchanging pleasantries, "I have a somewhat unusual request. The church committee is planning activities for the fall festival, and Reverend Collins suggested a special segment on pet adoption. Apparently, the story we shared about you and Quill on our shelter social media has generated quite a bit of interest locally." Alder balanced the phone against his shoulder, tightening a screw with careful precision. "What kind of request?" he asked, already suspecting the answer. "They're hoping you might speak briefly about your experience, just a few minutes during the Sunday afternoon program at the festival. Nothing elaborate, just your personal perspective on adopting a special needs cat." Miss Kearney paused, then added, "It would mean a great deal to our adoption efforts. Hearing from someone like you, well, it carries more weight than anything we could say." "Someone like me?" Alder echoed, setting down his screwdriver. "A respected community member who isn't the typical animal person," Ms. Kearney clarified. "Many people assume adoption is just for families with children or younger folks with active lifestyles. Your story shows that companionship can work for anyone at any stage of life." Alder's instinctive response was refusal. Public speaking had never been his forte, and the thought of standing before a crowd, sharing what felt like private experiences, made his stomach tighten uncomfortably. Yet even as these reservations formed in his mind, another thought emerged alongside them, an image of Quill as he'd first seen him, alone in that last cage, overlooked and unwanted. How many other animals waited in similar circumstances, needing only the right person to see beyond their imperfections? "I'll need to think about it," he finally said, neither accepting nor refusing outright. "Of course," Miss Kearney replied, her tone carefully neutral. "The festival is still 3 weeks away. Perhaps you could let me know by the end of the week." After hanging up, Alder sat at his kitchen table, turning the request over in his mind. The very idea of standing on a stage, all eyes upon him, ran counter to the quiet, unobtrusive life he'd cultivated for decades. Yet the past months had already led him far beyond his familiar boundaries, into new relationships, new responsibilities, new ways of engaging with the world around him. Quill entered the kitchen, drawn perhaps by the sound of Alder's voice or simply following his regular circuit of the house. He paused in the doorway, his single eye assessing Alder with that peculiar blend of detachment and awareness that still sometimes caught Alder by surprise. "What do you think?" Alder asked him, not expecting an answer, but finding comfort in the question itself. "Should we tell our story?" Quill blinked slowly, then approached the table and jumped onto the empty chair opposite Alder, a clear violation of the no cats on furniture rule that had been gradually eroding since his arrival. From this position, he fixed Alder with a steady gaze that seemed to say, "You already know the answer." Over the next 3 days, Alder found himself discussing the invitation with each of his newfound social connections. Junior thought it was a wonderful opportunity, offering to help him prepare notes for his talk. Paxson, now officially fostering Penny, the fearful shelter cat, was enthusiastically supportive, suggesting that Alder's example had influenced his own decision to volunteer regularly at the shelter. Even Mrs. Morrison, from across the street, upon hearing about the invitation during a chance encounter at the mailbox, offered her encouragement. "It's good for people to hear from someone like you," she said, echoing Miss Kearney's words in a way that made Alder wonder exactly what someone like him meant to others in Millbrook, especially the older folks who might be living alone. A pet can make such a difference. By Friday, Alder had made his decision. He called Ms. Kearney and agreed to speak, specifying that his talk would be brief and that he wouldn't be taking questions afterward, boundaries that felt necessary for his comfort. "Thank you, Mr. Shaw," Ms. Kearney said, her voice warm with genuine appreciation. "This will mean so much to our animals." The following weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Alder, accustomed to tackling projects with methodical thoroughness, approached his upcoming talk with the same attention to detail he would give to any household repair. He wrote out his thoughts, edited them ruthlessly, practiced in front of the bathroom mirror, and even allowed Junior to listen to a rehearsal, accepting her gentle suggestions for improvement. The content itself was straightforward: his unexpected connection with Quill, the adjustments they'd both made, the ways in which their partnership had enriched his life. What proved more challenging was finding the right tone. how to convey the depth of his experience without sentimentality, how to encourage others without presuming to advise them, how to speak from the heart while maintaining the dignity that was so central to his self-image. As the festival approached, Alder found himself increasingly aware of the broader impact Quill had made on his life. Beyond the day-to-day companionship, beyond even the expanding circle of social connections, there was a fundamental shift in how he engaged with the world, a willingness to accept imperfection, to adapt to unexpected circumstances, to find value in experiences that didn't fit neatly into his carefully ordered existence. The morning of the fall festival dawned clear and cool, with just enough breeze to stir the early autumn leaves. Millbrook's town square had been transformed overnight. Booths selling crafts and food lined the perimeter, hay bales created seating areas around a central stage, and strings of lights crisscrossed overhead, ready to illuminate the evening activities. Alder arrived early, partly from habit and partly to acclimate himself to the environment before the crowds arrived. He carried a small cardboard cat carrier, not the same one from their first meeting, but a newer, more comfortable model with mesh panels that allowed Quill to see out while feeling secure. After much consideration, he had decided to bring the cat with him, not to display or parade, but simply because it felt right that they should face this experience together. Ms. Kearney met them near the shelter's information booth, visibly pleased that Alder had arrived as promised. "We've scheduled you for 2 o'clock, she explained, showing him the program. "Just before the children's choir and after the mayor's welcome, about 5 minutes as we discussed." Alder nodded, setting the carrier carefully on a chair behind the booth where Quill could observe without being disturbed. "We'll be ready." As the morning progressed, the square filled with Millbrook residents and visitors from neighboring towns. Children ran between booths clutching cotton candy, local bands performed folk and country tunes on the small stage, and the air filled with the mingled scents of barbecue, cinnamon, and the first fallen leaves of autumn. Alder moved through the festival with Quill's carrier, stopping occasionally at booths that interested him or to exchange greetings with neighbors. What struck him most was how many people recognized him, not just as a familiar face, but as the man with the one-eyed cat. Strangers approached to ask about Quill, to share their own pet adoption stories, or simply to express admiration for what they'd heard through Millbrook's efficient grapevine of community news. "Is it true he found his way to the church during that big storm?" asked Mrs. Peterson, who taught 3rd grade at Millbrook Elementary. "My sister adopted a 3-legged dog last year," shared Mr. Davis from the hardware store. "Best decision she ever made." Even Sheriff Holloway, typically taciturn and formal, stopped to inquire about Quill's adjustment to domestic life, revealing that he had grown up on a farm where the barn cats were always the ones with the most character. By the time 2 o'clock approached, Alder had spoken more with his fellow townspeople than he had in the previous year combined. The experience was exhausting but also strangely affirming, each interaction a reminder that his private choice had rippled outward in ways he never could have anticipated. As he waited beside the stage for his introduction, Alder felt a familiar tightening in his chest, the anxiety of impending exposure, of stepping beyond his carefully maintained boundaries. He glanced down at the carrier, where Quill was watching the proceedings with calm interest, apparently unbothered by the noise and activity around them. "Taking our cues from you today," Alder murmured to the cat, courage in unfamiliar territory. On stage, Reverend Collins was making introductions, his voice carrying across the square through the sound system. "Many of you have heard about Alder Shaw and his special companion, Quill. Their story reminds us that connections can form in the most unexpected places between the most unlikely individuals. Please welcome them both to share a few words about their journey together." Applause rippled through the crowd as Alder climbed the 3 steps to the stage, carrier in hand. He set it on a small table that had been provided, opening the door so that Quill could emerge if he chose, though he suspected the cat would prefer the security of his enclosure. Standing behind the microphone, Alder looked out at the gathering of familiar and unfamiliar faces. For a moment, his carefully prepared words seemed to evaporate from his mind, leaving only the raw nervousness of public exposure. Then, from the carrier beside him, came a soft sound, not quite a meow, more like a chirp of encouragement. Quill had partially emerged, his single eye bright with interest as he surveyed the crowd from his safer vantage point. Somehow the cat's presence steadied him. Alder took a deep breath and began to speak, his voice low but clear, carrying across the attentive silence that had fallen over the square. 7 months ago, I walked into the Millbrook Animal Shelter thinking I needed to save a cat, he said. the words coming more easily now that he had begun. I was wrong. What I really needed was to let a cat save me from the isolation I'd built around myself. As he continued, describing their gradual building of trust, the challenges they'd overcome together, and the unexpected ways Quill had opened doors to new connections, Alder became aware of something remarkable. People were listening, truly listening, with an attention that felt almost tangible. Elderly couples leaned toward each other, exchanging glances of recognition. Parents pulled children closer. Individuals who had come alone nodded in silent understanding. When we choose to care for another being, Alder concluded, we're really choosing to become more fully ourselves. Quill didn't need perfection from me, just patience, consistency, and the willingness to adapt. In return, he taught me that routines aren't walls to hide behind, but bridges we can use to reach each other. He glanced down at the cat, who had fully emerged from the carrier and was sitting calmly beside it, apparently at ease despite the crowd. He may have only one eye, but he helped me see what I'd been missing. The applause that followed was warmer and more sustained than Alder had expected. As he gathered Quill back into his carrier and descended from the stage, he was met not just by Ms. Kearney's appreciative handshake, but by a small crowd of people wanting to thank him, to share their own stories, or simply to get a closer look at the cat who had inspired such transformation. Among them was an elderly woman Alder didn't recognize, her white hair neatly pinned back, her posture suggesting someone who had carried herself with dignity through many decades of life. "Mr. Shaw?" she said when she finally reached him, her voice carrying the slight tremor of advanced age. "I've been considering a pet since my Harold passed last winter, but I wasn't sure if it was practical at my age. Your words today, well, they've helped me decide. I'll be visiting the shelter next week." Before Alder could respond, she had moved on, making way for others who wanted to speak with him. But her words lingered, joining the chorus of responses that continued throughout the afternoon. Paxson reporting that 3 people had already signed up for shelter volunteering at their booth. Junior introducing him to her sister, visiting from Virginia, who was now considering fostering cats in her own community. Ms. Kearney whispering that a family had expressed interest in adopting a senior dog with health issues who had been overlooked for months. By the time Alder and Quill headed home as evening fell, both were exhausted from the unaccustomed social engagement, yet beneath the fatigue was a sense of accomplishment, unlike anything Alder had experienced in years, not the satisfaction of a repair completed or a task checked off a list, but the deeper fulfillment of having contributed something meaningful to the community around him. That night, as they settled into their familiar positions, Alder in his bed, Quill at his feet, he found himself reflecting on the day's events with a clarity that felt almost like revelation. The story he had shared wasn't just about a man and a cat finding common ground in their differences. It was about how that partnership had created ripples that extended far beyond them, touching lives they would never even know. "We made a difference today," he told Quill, who blinked sleepily in response. Not bad for a couple of loners. As he drifted towards sleep, Alder found himself thinking about the elderly woman who planned to visit the shelter, about Paxson's growing confidence as a volunteer, about the countless small ways in which their story had resonated with others seeking connection in their own lives. The impact of caring, he realized, was never confined to the immediate relationship. Like rings spreading outward from a stone dropped in still water, it moved beyond its point of origin, reaching shores unseen by those who had first set it in motion. In choosing Quill, in being chosen by him, Alder had unknowingly cast such a stone, creating ripples that would continue long after this day was done. It was perhaps the most unexpected gift of all, that in opening his home to one overlooked cat, he had somehow opened doors for others he would never meet, creating possibilities that extended far beyond the quiet house on Elm Street where their story had begun. Winter came early to Millbrook that year, with the first snowfall arriving in mid-November, earlier than anyone could remember. The delicate flakes began just after midnight, accumulating steadily until morning revealed a transformed landscape, white and hushed beneath a pearl-gray sky. Alder woke to this silent world and immediately noticed 2 things: the unusual quality of light filtering through his bedroom curtains, and Quill's absence from his customary spot at the foot of the bed. Moving to the window, he parted the fabric to find the yard blanketed in at least 6 inches of snow, with more still falling in lazy spirals from the heavy clouds above. Downstairs, he found Quill perched on the living room windowsill, his single eye fixed on the alien landscape outside. The cat's body was tense, his tail twitching slightly, signs of agitation that Alder had learned to recognize over their 10 months together. "First snow," Alder said by way of greeting. "Nothing to worry about. Happens every year." Quill didn't acknowledge him, continuing his vigilant watch of the transformed yard. As Alder prepared his morning coffee, he considered what this weather might mean to a cat who had once lived on the streets. Snow wasn't just an inconvenience or a pretty sight. It was a serious threat to survival, covering food sources, making movement difficult, intensifying the deadly cold of winter nights. No wonder Quill seemed disturbed by its appearance. Even years of indoor living couldn't erase the instinctive memory of such danger. Carrying his coffee to the living room, Alder settled in his armchair near the window. "We're safe and warm in here," he told Quill, his voice calm and matter-of-fact. "The snow stays outside. We stay inside. Simple arrangement." The cat glanced at him briefly, then returned to his snow-watching vigil. Alder didn't push the issue. Over their months together, he'd learned when reassurance was helpful and when Quill simply needed to process things in his own feline way. This seemed like the latter. The snowfall continued throughout the morning, eventually tapering off around noon with nearly a foot accumulated on the ground. Alder made necessary adjustments to his routine, cancelling his usual walk to the market, calling Junior to check on her supplies and well-being, clearing a small path from his back door to the shed where extra firewood was stored. Through it all, Quill remained primarily at the window, moving only to follow the sun's path across different viewpoints in the house. As evening approached, bringing an early darkness enhanced by the snow-reflected light, Alder built a fire in the fireplace and settled in for what promised to be a particularly cold night. The house creaked and settled around them, its old timbers contracting in the falling temperature, despite the steady heat from the furnace and the supplementary warmth of the fire. Quill finally abandoned his window watching to claim his box near the hearth, curling into a tight ball with his face partially hidden, a defensive sleeping position Alder hadn't seen him use in months. The regression to this protective posture suggested the snow had triggered old insecurities, reminding Quill of more vulnerable times. "We'll be fine," Alder assured him, more for his own benefit than the cat's. "This old house has weathered worse." The night deepened, bringing with it the peculiar silence that only heavy snow can create, a muffling of the world's ordinary sounds, as if everything beyond their walls had been wrapped in thick cotton. Alder checked the thermostat, added another log to the fire, and prepared for bed, expecting Quill to follow him upstairs as usual. Instead, the cat remained firmly in his box by the fire, apparently unwilling to leave its warmth and security. Alder didn't insist, respecting this choice as he did all of Quill's boundaries. "Suit yourself," he said with a shrug. "I'll leave the door open if you change your mind." Upstairs, the bedroom felt unusually empty without Quill's warm presence at the foot of the bed. Alder found himself listening to the house's night sounds with greater attention, the ticking of the old radiators, the occasional settling of snow sliding from the roof, the distant chime of the grandfather clock marking the hours. Sometime after midnight, he drifted into a light sleep punctuated by strange dreams of falling snow and distant bells. A sharp crack jolted him awake. For a moment, Alder lay perfectly still, trying to identify the sound that had disturbed his sleep. It came again, a distinct metallic popping followed by a rushing noise he couldn't immediately place. Something was wrong. Throwing back the covers, he grabbed his robe and slippers, moving quickly toward the stairs. The air felt wrong, colder than it should be despite the furnace's steady operation. As he descended, another crack echoed through the house, and this time he recognized it for what it was, the sound of freezing pipes expanding beyond their capacity. In the hallway leading to the kitchen, he found the source of the rushing noise. Water was seeping from beneath the door of the downstairs bathroom, a thin but steady flow spreading across the hardwood floor. A burst pipe, the homeowner's winter nightmare. "Damnation," Alder muttered, immediately calculating the sequence of actions needed. First, shut off the water main to prevent further damage. Then locate the break, assess the extent of the problem, and begin emergency repairs before the water could cause serious structural harm. He splashed through the growing puddle to the basement door, yanking it open and feeling for the light switch. Nothing happened when he flipped it. The power must have gone out, either from the storm or from water reaching an electrical connection. Cursing under his breath, he felt his way down the familiar steps to where he knew the main water valve was located, turning it with practiced efficiency despite the darkness. The immediate crisis contained, Alder made his way back upstairs, guided by the faint glow of moonlight reflected off snow through the windows. He needed light, tools, and dry towels to begin addressing the damage. Most importantly, he needed the collection of plumbing supplies he kept on the shelf above the washing machine, pipe wrenches, fittings, and the special tape that would be essential for temporary repairs. As he re-entered the hallway, his foot slipped on the wet floor, sending him lurching sideways. His shoulder hit the wall hard, and his knee, the one that had been troubling him since summer, twisted painfully as he tried to regain his balance. For a moment, Alder stood frozen, gripping the doorframe, waves of pain radiating from his knee, and the sickening realization that he might have seriously injured himself. "Not now," he muttered through clenched teeth. "Not like this." Cautiously testing his weight on the injured leg, he found he could stand, though not without considerable pain. Walking would be possible, but difficult. And the tasks ahead required more than just walking. They demanded crawling under sinks, kneeling beside pipes, and navigating a dark basement with armloads of supplies. In the dim light, Alder spotted movement near the kitchen doorway. Quill was watching him, his single eye reflecting the faint moonlight, his body alert and tense. "It's all right," Alder said automatically, though it clearly wasn't. "Just a small problem." The cat approached cautiously, avoiding the puddles spreading across the floor. He paused a few feet from Alder, head tilted slightly as if assessing the situation. "I need to fix this," Alder told him, more to organize his own thoughts than to communicate with Quill. "Need light first. Flashlights in the kitchen drawer, then tools from the laundry room. Then find the break." Moving with painful slowness, Alder made his way to the kitchen, each step sending sharp protests through his injured knee. He found the drawer by memory and located a flashlight, its beam mercifully strong when he switched it on. The harsh light revealed the extent of the water already spreading through the downstairs rooms, a glistening sheet covering most of the hallway floor and beginning to seep under the living room doorway. The situation was worse than he'd initially thought. Not only was the pipe in the bathroom wall broken, but the water had been flowing long enough to potentially cause serious damage to the flooring, subfloor, and possibly even the joists beneath. Every minute counted if he hoped to prevent structural problems that would be far beyond his ability to repair alone. Alder took a deep breath, steadying himself against the kitchen counter. He needed help, a fact he was reluctantly beginning to accept. But at 3 in the morning, during the worst snowstorm in recent memory, with phones likely down due to the power outage, getting that help would be nearly impossible. "Have to manage alone," he told himself firmly. "No choice." With the flashlight illuminating his path, Alder made his way toward the laundry room where his tools were stored. His progress was agonizingly slow, each step carefully calculated to minimize pain and avoid further injury. He was so focused on his own movement that he almost missed what Quill was doing. The cat had circled around him and was now positioned in the doorway of the laundry room, his body language unusually animated. As Alder approached, Quill darted inside, then reappeared in the doorway, looking back at him with pointed intensity. "I'm coming," Alder assured him, assuming the cat was simply disturbed by the unusual nighttime activity. But when he finally reached the laundry room, he found Quill positioned beside the washing machine, front paws on its base, looking up at the shelf where Alder's plumbing supplies were stored. The cat meowed, not the ordinary conversational sound he sometimes made, but a louder, more insistent vocalization that seemed deliberately attention-seeking. "Yes, that's what I need," Alder agreed, surprised by the cat's apparent understanding of the situation. "Good eye." Using the washing machine for support, Alder reached for the shelf, gathering the essential supplies: pipe wrench, adjustable wrench, plumber's tape, and a selection of fittings that might be needed for the repair. He placed these in a plastic bucket, along with clean rags to help manage the water already accumulated. The next challenge was carrying these supplies while maintaining his balance on his injured knee. Alder attempted to lift the bucket, but the movement sent a fresh bolt of pain through his leg, nearly causing him to drop everything. "Damn," he hissed, setting the bucket down again. Even this simple task was proving more difficult than anticipated. In the beam of the flashlight, he saw Quill watching him with what seemed like concern, his single eye tracking Alder's every movement. Then, with deliberate purpose, the cat approached the hallway door and meowed loudly, once, twice, 3 times in rapid succession. Alder was about to dismiss this as normal feline anxiety when he heard something unexpected, a human voice calling from outside. "Hello, is someone there, Mr. Shaw?" Disbelief momentarily overrode pain as Alder made his way to the front door. Opening it revealed Paxton Reeve, bundled against the cold, standing on his snow-covered porch with a larger flashlight in hand. "Paxton, what in the world are you doing here at this hour?" Alder asked, genuinely astonished. "I was up playing video games when the power went out," the young man explained, stamping snow from his boots. "I noticed your lights were on and then suddenly went off too. Then I thought I heard something. Sounded like a cat, yowling really loud. With the storm and everything, I figured I should check if you were okay." He peered past Alder into the darkened hallway. "Is everything all right? You're limping." Relief flooded through Alder with such intensity that he had to grip the doorframe for support. "Burst pipe," he explained succinctly, "and I've injured my knee. The timing couldn't be worse." Paxson didn't hesitate. "Let me help," he said, already stepping inside. "My dad's a contractor. I've helped him with plenty of plumbing emergencies." What followed was a flurry of activity that would have been impossible for Alder alone. Paxson, with the energy and flexibility of youth, crawled beneath the bathroom sink to locate the exact point of rupture, while Alder directed him from the doorway, providing guidance based on decades of home maintenance experience. Together, they fashioned a temporary repair using pipe wrenches, plumber's tape, and a coupling Alder had fortunately purchased months earlier for an unrelated project. With the immediate crisis contained, they turned to damage control, soaking up water with every towel in the house, positioning buckets under minor leaks that persisted, and creating a makeshift barrier of rolled blankets to prevent water from reaching the living room's wooden floors. Throughout it all, Quill remained present, but unobtrusive, watching from elevated positions, the back of the sofa, the kitchen counter, the top of the refrigerator, as if supervising their work while staying safely above the wet floors he so disliked. Dawn was breaking by the time they had done everything possible without professional assistance. Alder's knee had swollen significantly, and exhaustion lined his face, but the worst had been prevented. Paxson insisted on staying until they could reach a plumber, making coffee on the gas stove that thankfully didn't require electricity, and helping Alder elevate his injured leg on the sofa. "I still can't believe you heard Quill from your house," Alder remarked, accepting a steaming mug from Paxson. "You must have exceptional hearing." Paxson shook his head. It wasn't just that he was loud, though he definitely was. It was the way he sounded. Different than normal cat noises, more like he was deliberately trying to alert someone. He glanced at Quill, who was now grooming himself on the window seat as if the night's drama had never occurred. Smart cat. Alder followed his gaze, studying Quill with new appreciation. Smarter than I realized, apparently. By mid-morning, the power had been restored, phones were working again, and Alder had arranged for both a plumber and a visit to the urgent care clinic for his knee. Paxson reluctantly left to catch some sleep before his afternoon shift at the market, promising to check in later and help with any additional cleanup. Left alone with Quill for the first time since the crisis began, Alder found himself re-evaluating yet another aspect of their relationship. He had always credited the cat with intelligence, his ability to learn routines, to communicate his needs, to navigate the complex territory of their shared home. But this was something different, an apparent understanding of danger, an ability to recognize when help was needed, and most remarkably, the initiative to summon that help in the only way available to him. "You called for backup," Alder said to Quill, who had moved to the arm of the sofa near his elevated leg. "Knew I couldn't manage alone." The cat blinked slowly, neither confirming nor denying, but the connection between them felt somehow deeper than before, forged in crisis, tempered by mutual reliance. Later that day, after returning from the clinic with his knee properly examined, a severe sprain fortunately not requiring surgery, Alder found himself sharing the night's events with Junior, who had come to check on him once she heard about his injury. "It's remarkable," she said, preparing a simple dinner in his kitchen while he rested his bandaged knee, almost as if he understood exactly what was happening and what needed to be done. "Animals know more than we give them credit for," Alder replied, recalling their conversation months earlier about pets sensing things humans couldn't. "Still," Junior persisted, "there's something special about your connection with him. You understand each other in a way that goes beyond ordinary pet and owner." Alder considered this as he watched Quill patrol the perimeter of the room, inspecting the baseboards where water had flowed the night before. The restoration company had already removed the damaged drywall in the bathroom, set up industrial fans to dry the affected areas, and scheduled repairs for the following week. The crisis had been contained, but the memory of those dark, painful moments remained vivid, as did the image of Quill positioning himself by the plumbing supplies, meowing with unprecedented volume and urgency. "We've learned each other's languages," he finally said. "That's all it is. He speaks with movement and sound, I speak with routine and consistency. Sometimes we understand each other better than expected. Junior smiled, setting a plate of scrambled eggs and toast before him, comfort food for a difficult day. That's what all good relationships come down to, isn't it? Learning each other's languages, trusting the communication even when it's imperfect. The next few weeks brought further evidence of this deepening communication. As Alder's mobility remained limited by his knee injury, Quill seemed to adjust his own behaviors in response, staying closer throughout the day, alerting Alder when the telephone rang in another room, even fetching small items that had fallen to the floor by pushing them within reach with his paw. These behaviors weren't trained or requested. They emerged organically from their shared circumstance, from the cat's apparent recognition of Alder's temporary limitations. Most remarkably, Quill began sleeping pressed against Alder's injured knee at night, his warm body providing a comforting pressure that seemed to ease the persistent ache. By Christmas, which arrived with another substantial snowfall, Alder's knee had improved enough for limited mobility without crutches. The repaired bathroom wall had been repainted, the damaged flooring replaced, and the house had largely returned to its pre-flood condition, though Alder now checked weather forecasts with greater attention and had installed frost-resistant pipe insulation throughout the vulnerable areas of his plumbing system. The holiday itself brought unexpected gifts. Junior invited both Alder and Quill to Christmas dinner, setting a place for the cat complete with a tiny plate of unseasoned turkey. Paxson stopped by with a handcrafted climbing tower for Quill, built from reclaimed wood and covered with carpet remnants, a project inspired, he explained, by his growing interest in making things with his hands rather than just selling them at the market. Ms. Kearney delivered a holiday basket from the shelter staff, including a framed photograph of Alder and Quill from the fall festival that had apparently become something of a mascot for their special needs adoption program. Applications for our harder-to-place animals have doubled since your talk, she told him, her practical expression softened by genuine gratitude. You've made a real difference. Even Reverend Collins made an appearance, bringing not only holiday wishes, but news that the church council had approved a small pet blessing service for the spring, an idea inspired, he admitted, by the story of Quill's connection to the church bells. These visitors came and went throughout the day, creating a patchwork celebration unlike any Alder had experienced in his years in Millbrook. Between these social interludes, he and Quill enjoyed quieter moments, watching the snow from the comfort of the fireplace-warmed living room, sharing bites of holiday treats, carefully selected for feline safety, and simply existing together in the peaceful home they had created. As evening fell and the last visitor departed, Alder settled into his armchair with a book he'd received as a gift. Quill, after completing his post-company inspection of the house, jumped onto the chair's arm and then, in an unprecedented move, directly onto Alder's lap. Without ceremony, he arranged himself in a comfortable circle, his weight warm and solid, his single eye closing in apparent contentment. Alder remained perfectly still, surprised by this new development. In all their months together, Quill had never chosen his lap as a resting place, preferring nearby surfaces that allowed for proximity without direct contact. This deliberate choice to settle directly upon him felt significant, a new level of trust, a further dismantling of old defenses. Carefully, Alder lowered one hand to stroke the soft fur between Quill's ears. The cat responded with a deep, rumbling purr that seemed to vibrate through both their bodies. Outside, snow continued to fall silently, transforming the world once again. Inside, another transformation was completing itself, the gradual, patient evolution of two solitary beings into something stronger and more complete than either had been alone. "We've come a long way," Alder murmured, his voice barely audible above the purring. "Both of us." The journey had not been what either of them might have expected on that first day at the shelter. There had been adjustments and misunderstandings, moments of frustration and breakthrough, tests of trust and unexpected challenges. Through it all, they had established something Alder now recognized as their greatest shared achievement: a reliable rhythm of care and response, attention and space, protection and independence, what he had come to think of as the routine of courage. It took courage, after all, to open oneself to new possibilities after years of solitude. It took courage to trust after experiencing abandonment, to reach out when retreat felt safer. It took courage to adapt to another's needs without losing one's own essential nature. And perhaps most importantly, it took courage to accept help when circumstances demanded it, a lesson both man and cat had learned together. As the year drew to a close, and a new one prepared to begin, Alder found himself thinking about that first question that had lingered in the air of the shelter months ago. Why choose this cat, of all cats? The answer, which had seemed simple then, had revealed its complexity over time. He hadn't just chosen Quill for what the cat had already experienced, the understanding of being left aside. He had chosen him for what they would experience together, the discovery that being left aside wasn't the end of the story, but perhaps just the beginning. In the quiet house on Elm Street, as snow continued to fall and Quill's purr filled the space between them, Alder recognized the truth that had been gradually revealing itself all along. In a town of predictable rhythms and reliable patterns, the most meaningful routine was the one they had created together. The daily choice to move toward connection rather than away from it, to trust rather than withdraw, to build something new from the materials of old wounds and careful hopes. It was, in the end, the simplest and most profound of lessons. Everything that heals arrives slowly, requires care, demands patience, and when it finally comes, it changes the very name of silence to companionship. Spring returned to Millbrook with its usual flourish, crocuses pushing through the last patches of snow, robins reclaiming territory in budding trees, and the air softening with promise after winter's sharp edge. On Elm Street, new growth appeared in Alder's garden, carefully planned and tended through the cold months with seed catalogues and graph paper sketches. A year had passed since that fateful Saturday, when Alder Shaw had walked into the Millbrook Animal Shelter and chosen the least likely cat, or perhaps, as he sometimes thought in quieter moments, when that unlikely cat had chosen him. The anniversary hadn't gone unnoticed. Ms. Kearney had called the previous day to remind him of the milestone and to share the news that Quill's story had inspired 17 special needs adoptions over the past 12 months, a record for the small shelter. On this particular morning, Alder stood on his porch, coffee in hand, watching Quill explore the garden with his usual methodical attention. The cat moved with confident familiarity through the territory that had become undeniably his, pausing occasionally to investigate an interesting scent or to rub his cheek against a favorite plant marker. So much had changed in a year, yet the fundamental rhythms of their life together remained consistent. Breakfast at 7, Quill's supervised garden time while Alder enjoyed his coffee, shared quiet evenings by the fire or on the porch depending on the weather. What had once been conscious adjustments had become natural habits. What had begun as tentative accommodations had evolved into comfortable routines. The changes extended beyond their household. Paxson had not only adopted Penny, his once fearful foster cat, but had started a small business building custom cat furniture, inspired by the climbing tower he'd created for Quill. Junior had postponed her planned move to be closer to her children, finding unexpected fulfillment in her growing involvement with the shelter's socialization program for difficult cases. The Fall Festival now included a permanent pet adoption component, and Reverend Collins' pet blessing service had become a popular annual event. Smaller ripples continued to spread outward. Mrs. Peterson's third-grade class had started a letter-writing project to animal shelters across the state. The elderly woman who had approached Alder after his talk, Mrs. Eleanor Finch, he had later learned, had indeed adopted a senior cat with arthritis, and the pair had become minor celebrities at the Millbrook Senior Center, where she volunteered. Alder observed these developments with quiet satisfaction, aware that none of them would have occurred without that initial choice, a choice that had seemed so simple at the time, but had proven so far-reaching in its consequences. The sound of the mail truck pulling up to the curb drew his attention. Since his knee injury, Alder had developed a friendlier relationship with Frank, the mail carrier, who now brought packages directly to the porch rather than leaving them in the box at the street. Today, Frank climbed the steps with a large envelope in hand. "Morning, Mr. Shaw," he called cheerfully. "Special delivery today. Needs a signature." Alder set down his coffee and accepted the pen Frank offered, signing the electronic pad with his neat, precise handwriting. "Thank you. Expecting some gardening supplies, but not until next week." "This is from the mayor's office," Frank said, handing over the envelope. "Looks official." After Frank departed, Alder examined the envelope with curiosity. The mayor's seal was indeed stamped in the corner, along with "official business" in bold letters. Opening it carefully, he found a formal letter requesting his presence at the next town council meeting, specifically to discuss his potential appointment to the newly formed Animal Welfare Committee, which would advise on policies relating to pets and strays in Millbrook. "What do you think of that?" Alder asked Quill, who had returned to the porch and was now washing his face with fastidious care. "They want my opinion on community matters." They're quite a change from a year ago. The cat paused in his grooming to blink slowly at Alder before returning to his important task, apparently unimpressed by municipal politics. Alder chuckled, refolding the letter and slipping it back into its envelope. He would accept, of course. The opportunity to shape policies that might help other animals find homes as good as Quill's was too meaningful to decline. Besides, he found himself increasingly comfortable with these community connections, no longer hiding behind his routines, but using them as frameworks within which relationships could flourish. As he picked up his coffee again, now cooled to the perfect drinking temperature, Alder noticed a familiar figure approaching along the sidewalk. Junior waved as she spotted him, carrying what appeared to be a potted plant of some kind. "Good morning," she called. "I found this catmint at the garden center yesterday and thought of Quill. Most cats love it. It's perfectly safe, just gives them a bit of harmless pleasure." Alder welcomed her onto the porch, accepting the plant with thanks. "You've become quite the feline expert," he observed, as she settled into the chair beside his. "I've had good teachers," she replied, smiling as Quill approached to inspect her shoes, his customary greeting ritual. Both human and feline, they sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the neighborhood come to life around them, Mrs. Morrison deadheading her daffodils across the street, the Henderson children waiting for the school bus at the corner, a pair of cardinals chasing each other through the maple branches overhead. "It's adoption anniversary day, isn't it?" Junior finally asked, though Alder suspected she knew the exact date. He nodded, watching as Quill completed his inspection of Junior's shoes and moved to the railing to observe a squirrel in the yard. "1 year ago today. Any reflections on the experience so far?" she prompted, her tone light but genuinely interested. Alder considered the question, taking a sip of coffee while he gathered his thoughts. So much had happened in 12 months. Small triumphs and challenges, unexpected lessons, moments of connection that had gradually transformed his understanding of what home truly meant. "I've been thinking about languages," he said finally. "Not just how Quill and I learned to communicate, but how that process changed us both. We didn't just adapt to each other. We created something new between us, a shared language that neither of us knew before." Junior nodded encouragingly, clearly following his train of thought. "And that language," Alder continued, watching as Quill returned to sit beside his chair, a position that had become his preferred morning spot. "It doesn't just allow us to understand each other. It creates a space where both of us belong, exactly as we are. No need to be more perfect, more social, more anything than what comes naturally." "A language of belonging," Junior suggested, her eyes warm with understanding. "Exactly that," Alder agreed, surprised and pleased by her perfect articulation of what he had been trying to express. "A language of belonging." As if to confirm this observation, Quill stretched up to place his front paws on Alder's knee, the once injured knee that had now healed completely, and chirped softly, a sound that had become his way of requesting morning acknowledgement. Alder reached down to stroke the cat's head, fingers gently tracing the scarred area around his missing eye, markings that had once seemed like flaws, but now registered simply as familiar features of a beloved face. In that moment, surrounded by the quiet sounds of a spring morning in Millbrook, with Junior's companionable presence beside him and Quill's warm weight against his leg, Alder felt the fullness of what they had created together. Not just a home, not just a routine, but a language in which solitude and connection were no longer opposites, but complementary parts of the same rich existence. A year ago, the entire shelter had wondered why this reserved man had chosen only this one-eyed tabby cat, passing by all the more perfect, more appealing options. Today, the answer seemed both simpler and more profound than anyone could have guessed, because in the quiet space between them, they had found not just safety or comfort, but the possibility of transformation, the chance to become more fully themselves through the patient, daily practice of understanding each other. It was, Alder reflected as he finished his coffee and prepared to start the day's activities, the most valuable language he had ever learned. This grammar of small kindnesses, this vocabulary of consistent care, this syntax of trust renewed each morning in the quiet light of shared routines. A language not of words but of presence, not of demands but of invitation, not of perfection but of acceptance. The language of belonging, spoken fluently at last by both man and cat in the house on Elm Street, where silence had finally found its true name, home.